Okay, so this is the circumstances of this are set up for a disaster. So, um, what happened is the Chiefs they came in, uh, and there were 12 Chiefs that came in, clearly ready to parlay, unarmed, not expecting any trouble at all. They met with the Texas delegation at a place called the Council House, which, if you know downtown San Antonio, was a stone building that was directly across from San Fernando Cathedral on the east side of the main plaza. It doesn't exist anymore. It's been torn down. So it was a courthouse. There was a jail near it, and what happened was this was a very public event. Um, so the Chiefs are talking to the Texans, and some of the Comanche boys were actually showing off their bow and arrow skills to the crowd in the plaza. And supposedly, according to one account, people would flip coins in the air, and the Comanche boys would show their skill by shooting the coin and hitting the coin with an arrow. And back in the council house, the negotiations, the parley began pretty inauspiciously as the Texans reminded the Comanches that they had promised to return with all their captives, not just one. And the leader of the Comanche delegation said that they had brought the only captive that they had, and that the rest were dispersed among other smaller Comanche groups. Um, the Texans knew that that was not true. Um, and what they said to the Chiefs, they brought in remember there had been three companies of militia sent to San Antonio in case that the Comanche had not brought in all the hostage. They line up the Comanche, or they attempt to line up the Comanche chiefs up against the wall. They tell the Comanche chiefs the men and women can leave peacefully. I'm sorry, not the men and women. The women and children could leave peacefully, but that the Comanche chiefs would be held hostage until the other captives were returned. The interpreter, who was actually had been a Comanche captive himself, and that's why he knew Comanche, um, he he actually refused to translate this news because he knew that this was going to be trouble, and it was going to ignite a fight. But then he translated the message from the Texans to the Comanche Chiefs, and then he bolted out the door because he knew what was going to happen. And what happened is just what the interpreter expected. The Comanche chiefs let out war whoops. They strung their bows. They pulled their knives. They started attacking everyone that they could attack in sight. And within seconds, all the 12 chiefs had been shot dead, and several of the Texas troops were killed or injured. Um, the the Comanche who were outside, remember the women and the children, they heard what was going on in the council house, and they scattered in every direction. One Indian who had been shooting the coins in the air, he turned towards one of the judges and killed him by shooting him through the heart with an arrow. Soldiers shot into the crowd, killing civilians and Comanches indiscriminately. So what you had was this complete, utter confusion as these Comanches are running through San Antonio. Some men who were not chiefs are running through San Antonio, and they have to be flushed from nearby homes and businesses. One the children and the women, many of them escaped. There was one holdout that was in home, and finally, what they did was they dropped a burning turpentine. They put turpentine on a big ball of cotton and dropped it in and killed him by burning him to death. When all was over, when all was said and done, 30 Comanche chiefs and warriors, 3 women and 2 children were killed in the so-called Council House fight. So 30 Comanche chiefs and warriors, 3 women and 2 children. If this was a plot by the Texans, it was very successful because what you had was, in a certain sense, the decapitation of the Pennateca tribes, because the leading chiefs had come into San Antonio for this parley, and within a minute or two, they're all dead. Along with other Indians who had come into San Antonio. Clearly, they had come into San Antonio not expecting the kind of trouble that they found. And what, in retrospect, what the Comanche didn't realize is when they're dealing with the Anglo-Americans or Anglo-Texans, I guess you'd say at this point, that it's very different than dealing with the Spanish. It's very different than dealing with the Mexican government. There's going to be a lot more resistance. There's going to be a lot more fighting, a lot more violence. So 27 women and children were captured. Most actually eventually escaped and returned to the Comancheria. 7 Texas soldiers and civilians were killed, and 10 wounded, and poor Matilda Lockhart died 2 years later. What a tragic figure. So that's the Council House fight, Council House massacre. By the way, you don't need to know the exact numbers of everybody that was killed. The thing I want you to take home from this is you had a number of chiefs, 12 chiefs that were killed, which was basically a decapitation of the leadership of the Pennateca in Texas. So one of the captives was sent back to the Comanche camp, which was outside of town, and she came with a demand for the Comanches to release the 13 captives. And if those captives were released, the Comanches that had been captured in San Antonio would be released as well. Instead, and horribly, the Comanches, being who they were, took revenge on the captives and murdered them. And I'm not going to go into detail, but the 13 captives were basically, the 13 Anglo captives were basically tortured and killed by the Comanches in retribution for what had happened at the Council House fight. You can only imagine how much they suffered. It was, I'm sure, is quite horrible. So what the Comanche do in revenge for this fight is that 5 months later, in the fall of 1840, they launched the biggest raid that the Comanches ever launched in Texas. A number of the Comanche bands come together with other Norteño allies, about 1,000 warriors, swept down into South Texas. They attacked Victoria, which of course is southeast of San Antonio. There was a port called Linville, which was also attacked, and the only reason that the folks in Linville survived this raid was they actually got on boats and rowed into the Gulf of Mexico, where the Indians couldn't get them. And so you had this major attack by around 1,000 Comanche warriors in direct retaliation for the Council House fight. Now, it's interesting, the word fight. You could also call it the Council House massacre. I guess it depends on your point of view. So, by the way, Linville it was destroyed during this raid, and then out of that, the townspeople of Linville moved a couple miles up the Gulf of Mexico and created what now is Port Lavaca, which is still a community in Texas. In return, Texas Rangers followed the Comanche, who were slowed. These warriors, they were slowed because they had taken so much loot. They'd stolen so many horses. They had so much loot. They weren't traveling very quickly. And near Lockhart, Texas, there was the so-called Battle of Plum Creek. in which the Texas Rangers claimed that they defeated the Comanches in a battle. Now, it's very unclear if actually the Comanches were defeated. One of the tactics of the Comanche, often when they traveled, they would travel with women and children. One of the tactics of the Comanche, it was they would ride around and create great confusion, and this would allow the slower moving part of the overall caravan to get out of the way. So there's some speculation that the Comanches really weren't that defeated, that they were able to allow they were able to get back into the Comanchery with most of their loot. But in any event, at the Battle of Plum Creek, the Comanches were at least chastened for what they had done in southeast Texas. Now, it's important to note that the Comanches never, ever managed to create an army to invade Texas in those numbers again. They consistently do that in Mexico, but this is a one and only in the history of Texas, both during Anglo-Tex or the Texas Republic period or after. And it was in direct response to the what had happened at the Council House. And what happened is the longer term reaction of the Council House fight is that you have a 40-year guerrilla war between the Comanche and the Texans that doesn't end until the late 1870s. Very bloody. The Comanche never forgot what happened at the Council House. They clearly saw it as a trap, as a massacre. And it would have been violent anyway as Texans moved into the Comancheria. But given the Comanche's thirst for revenge, it becomes horrifically violent on the Texas frontier, north of UTSA and west of UTSA. And as I said earlier in an earlier podcast, if you were captured by a Comanche, you would never in a million years admit that you were a Texan, because that would have been an automatic death sentence, and it would have been a way to die quite horribly. So the consequences of the Council House event of 1840, notice how I use the neutral word event, was the beginnings of a 40-year guerrilla war between Texans and between Comanches that would not be completed until later, in almost to the end of the 1870s and into the early 1880s.